Okay. Uh, a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for this talk today. Before starting with the talk, I'll just give you a brief idea of what Anveshan is. So we're a forum of academicians, researchers, journalists, and activists who share a commitment to the idea of a progressive social transformation. We've been active for many years, and for more than 2 years since the onset of the pandemic, we've been regularly organizing online talks and discussions around the economic, social, and political topics that are relevance to a progressive idea of change. For those who wish to know more about Anveshan, please feel free to write to us at our email ID is anveshansecretary@gmail.com. The talk that we're organizing today is a joint effort by Anveshan, Delhi Science Forum, and Newsclick. So we'll be talking about the talk today will be centered around the recent changes by the government in NCERT textbooks attempted towards the deletion and rewriting of history and science. And the panel that we have today consists of two speakers. We have Professor Amar Faruqi with us, who is an eminent historian, and we have Prabir Purkayastha, who is the editor-in-chief of Newsclick and also the president of Delhi Science Forum. And the talk will be chaired by Harleen Kaur. Harleen is a PhD candidate at NIEPA and is also associated with the Tricontinental Institute of Social Research. So without taking much of your time, I'll just hand it over to the chair for the session. Harleen, over to you.
Thank you, Pranav. So as Pranav has already started with the context in which this discussion is being organized, so I'll speak a little about the context, and then I'll invite the speakers to speak one after the other. So the NCERT, which is National Council of Educational Research and Training, it prepares and publishes model textbooks for schools in India. And it has recently introduced several changes in the textbooks. The changes which have happened are they appear in the form of many chapters being deleted from the books of science, social science, and languages. Altogether, they have been deleted altogether, and there have been several topics which have been diluted in science and mathematics curriculum, as well as in the social science curriculum. The textbooks in which these changes have been made, they were prepared according to the National Curriculum Framework of 2005. Now, this was the National Curriculum Framework which was brought out under the UPA 1 government. Regarding its move, the NCERT says that the aim of the changes is to reduce the burden on the students given the context of the disruptions which have been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So till here, the question of why these changes have been made, it appears to be very simplistic, that the aim is to reduce the burden on the students. But once we start exploring the what of the changes, what has been reduced, what has been deleted, we see that a different debate opens up. Many professors, renowned historians, scientists, and scholars have written articles, and they have also issued joint statements saying that they are against these moves, they condemn these changes, and that they claim that these changes serve the ideological goals of the incumbent government. As Pranav has already talked about, Anveshan and Delhi Science Forum, which have jointly organized the program today, the theme of the program is Deleting History, Rewriting Science, the case of NCERT textbooks. Should I invite Professor Faruqi first?
Yeah.
Okay. So I invite Professor Faruqi to speak on the topic, and I also request the viewers to send their queries in the chat box so that we can later take up their questions. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Harleen, and I'm grateful to Anveshan and Delhi Science Forum for giving me this opportunity to say a few things about what's been happening to the NCERT textbooks. Now, there's already a sort of substantial critique of it in large number of writings, statements which have been issued on these changes which have been made. And I'll be talking about one particular set of history textbooks, But I would like to begin by saying that, frankly, I'm not an expert on most of those chapters or portions which have been deleted and which I will be talking about, though I do have an interest in many of these themes. As you perhaps know, we have had two sets of NCERT history textbooks. One written initially in the late 60s onwards, by very eminent historians like Romila Thapar, R.S. Sharma, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra. And these textbooks initially, when they were sort of welcomed, and these were really sort of textbooks which raised this academic standard of for teaching history. Though in 1977 they came under attack, and there were demands to make changes, and then in the again around 2000, around 2004-5, there were again problems with these textbooks, and a new set of textbooks was then introduced in 2007. Now, these follow the earlier model in the sense that they have maintained a very high academic standard. They are written by, again, very well-known scholars in their respective areas of specialization as historians. And these are the books which, for class 6, 7, 8, and class 11 and 12, which have been tampered with in a way which has obviously a political purpose. Now, the books which I will be focusing on are the two textbooks for class 11 and 12. Or rather, there are actually three textbooks, but I'll be focusing only on two of them, one for class 11 and the other for class 12. Themes in world history for class 11 and themes in Indian history for class 12. The books, if you go through these the chapters for these books. Now, before we begin discussing the deletions, it must be borne in mind that these are textbooks written for those students who have chosen to specialize in history, with perhaps the objective of either pursuing it in at the university level or for careers which like journalism or some other career where a good knowledge of history might be useful. So these are meant for those who specialize in history. These are class 6, 7, 8. It's taught to all students, but these are books which are intended for students who've chosen to specialize. So this is something which we need to keep in mind when we are talking about these textbooks. And if you look at the deletions, quickly to give you a broad overview. So there's a chapter which is actually the first chapter in themes in world history, the beginning of time. Then there's another chapter on the Central Islamic lands. There's a chapter on the Industrial Revolution. And for class 12, the three sort of portions which have been deleted. One focuses on the 16th and 17th century. It's called Kings and Chronicles, and another on understanding partition, and yet another on colonial cities. So broadly, these are the chapters which have been, or themes which have been deleted from these textbooks. And I'll be focusing on these themes. So I'll come back to the class 11 textbook, that's Themes in World History, towards the end of my talk, because that will sort of link up with what Prabir will be talking about. But let me begin by sort of talking about the one very significant chapter and an extremely well-written chapter. Most of the chapters are very well written, which has been deleted from the class 11 Themes in World History textbook. And this is the chapter or theme entitled, or the section entitled, Central Islamic Lands. Now, this is an important chapter because this covers a wide range of historical themes, historical issues, and also reflects the kind of scholarship, the extensive scholarship that is available on these themes. So this is a portion which deals. This is a portion which deals with the rise of Islam. Then it goes on to talk about subsequent developments like the Umayyad Caliphate, followed by the Abbasid Caliphate, and it sort of discusses in considerable detail cultural, intellectual, religious, scientific developments that took place in an area extending, a part of the globe extending from Spain to the Indian subcontinent and even beyond. So this omission means that students, first of all, the way this chapter has been removed, it actually would leave the student wondering what happened in the period between the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire, because the chapter which precedes this is a chapter on the Roman Empire, which brings the story down to the 7th century, and which includes the Germanic invasions, migrations, the splitting up of the empire between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, then the growth of the Byzantine Empire. It also has something on the Sassanids in Iran, and it comes down to around the end of the middle of the 7th century, and the last para, in fact, connects with the following chapter, which is the chapter which has been deleted, which is the changes which came about in West Asia with the beginnings of Islam and the growth of and the expansion which began, the Arab expansion which began to take place from the end of the 7th century, early 8th century. So it covers that period. So this, and then there's a chapter which which follows the deleted chapter, which is about nomadic empires, which focuses actually on the Mongols under Genghis Khan. So the focus is on Genghis Khan, and it sort of ends with the death of Genghis Khan, and the destruction of Baghdad in the middle of the 13th century. So its focus is mainly 13th and the 14th centuries. So in chronological terms, there is this huge gap that that a student would have about what's happening in the world. So if the idea of the book, the way the book is designed, it's meant to give them both a connected account in chronological terms, but also to focus on different kinds of societies which have evolved. So the broader title of this theme is actually empires. So there are three kinds of state formations which are being talked about. One is the Roman Empire. Then there is the rise of Islam, and the growth of a new kind of state in West Asia, extending to other parts of the world, North Africa, Spain, and in the East, in in Iran, in Afghanistan, Central Asia. So it sort of gives an account of these three empires. In doing so, it actually provides a sort of good idea about the way in which changes occurred in the period roughly between late 7th century AD to about the beginning of the 13th century. So there's that chronological gap. So what's happening in the world, there's very significant developments that happening, taking place. And this is not just the rise of Islam, the growth of the Caliphate, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, the other the Sultanates which followed them, the Seljuks and so on. But it's also about some of the other formations which are non-Islamic. So there is the Byzantine Empire, there are discussions on the Byzantine Empire, there are discussions on, there's a discussion on the Sassanids, and of course changes which are taking place in Central Asia. So the student would actually have no understanding of how these developments took place, nor of the interactions that took place over this vast area between different societies. So that interconnectedness of history is something that they would completely miss out on, at least insofar as this period is concerned. But it's also a matter of concern that that portion of the book which actually would acquaint students with the beginnings of Islam, which summarizes some of the important teachings of Islam, which also talks about the changes that took place in Islamic polity over a period of time, the way in which new kinds of states emerged in West Asia, in Central Asia, in parts of North Africa from the 9th, 10th, 11th, during the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, which also then would talk about the role which these societies played in the development of science, of technology, of learning, the way in which these societies were also sort of played an important role in the exchanges of ideas which took place between parts of the West, the West Asia, Europe, West Asia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent. This entire phase of history, and these developments are something which students would not know about. For also in terms of the Indian subcontinent, if you're talking about Indian history, it also is this provides students with an understanding of Islam as a religion, as part of this sort of history, and this is something which is rather disturbing, that something which would acquaint students with the sort of historical development of Islam, which is so relevant to Indian society, understanding Indian society and India's past, is something which has been completely done away with. There's nothing in place of this as of now. So apart from the chronological considerations, there are these considerations, but there is also another kind of academic consideration, which is that the team which put together this particular section, just as other sections, they are also making use of the rich sort of historiography on these themes. So the purpose of a textbook is not merely to talk about certain events, it's also to familiarize students with the kind of scholarship which exists, and what are the kind of questions which that scholarship is sort of putting forward, and which people are interested in, the kind of new issues which historians are interested in. None of that gets reflected, and none of that gets communicated to students. And these are students who are training, who are sort of to be historians. So they have to be familiar with the recent trends in historical writing and historiography, and that's something again which they would not be able to learn about if something like this is deleted. And the other chapter which I wanted to say something about is the chapter on the Mughals, on which there's been a large amount, there's been quite a lot of focus and discussion. But I think it's important to see, what has been deleted and what has been retained. So the class 12 textbook on Indian history has 2 chapters, Themes in Indian History, part 3, has 2 chapters on the Mughals. One of those chapters deals with the economic history, rural society, women, the revenue system. It also introduces the Ain-e-Akbari as a source to students. In fact, that's something which is done in all the chapters or all the themes to acquaint students with some source which would be interesting, which is relevant to that particular theme, so that students can get some idea about how historians use sources to reconstruct the past of to reconstruct history and to write history. So in this chapter, the source which they have used is the Ain-e-Akbari, which is relevant to the kind of discussion that is there in this chapter. The chapter which has been deleted is a chapter entitled Kings and Chronicles. Both the chapters actually focus on the 16th and the 17th century, the Mughals, but generally they focus on the 16th and the developments of the 16th and the 17th centuries. So the Kings and Chronicles deals with a slightly different set of historical issues, namely state formation, Mughal kingship, sovereignty, notions of sovereignty. These are some of the issues which, and again, the kind of sources. Also, there's something on, there's a very rich discussion on art, and the source which this chapter introduces the student to is the Badshah Nama of Abdul Hamid Lahori, an important source. And again, it is through this source that many of these issues are discussed. So the dropping of this chapter, in fact, makes, the 2 chapters are visualized as a whole. Different sets of issues in these 2 chapters on the 16th and the 17th centuries, and focusing again on the Mughals, a focus which perhaps the NCERT felt the Mughals did not deserve. So far too many pages devoted to Mughals, but then it creates an absence as far as the student training to be a good historian is concerned, because there are aspects of the Badshah Nama as a source which are discussed in this chapter, and which the student is familiarized with, to be able to understand how a source of this kind is used. So the Ain-e-Akbari is a source of a slightly different kind. The Badshah Nama is a source of a different kind. Then there is sources which are referred to as tawarikhs, are again historical narratives, how they came to be written. So there's a new kind of historical writing which is which is evolving in this period. Who are the people who are associated with it? So there are there's the way in which scribes were part of the Mughal the official establishment. Those are some of the things which are talked about. Now, this again is not just because it is Mughals or 2 periods, although there's no need to be apologetic about that in any case. After all, the Mughals are very important to the history of the Indian subcontinent and even beyond for these 2 centuries, the 16th and the 17th centuries, particularly the 17th century, the latter half of the 16th and the entire 17th century, and in fact also the first half of the 18th century. So almost 200 years of history and important historical questions related to that history are now removed from this text in a way which shows little respect for the protocols of history, academic as well as the pedagogical requirements of students at that stage of learning. This is a class 12 textbook. Yeah, so these are students, if they choose to pursue history, they would then go on. The next year would be they would be doing their undergraduate study. So they would be sort of the way in which the syllabus is designed. And please, again, I think it's important to understand it's not just this chapter removed from there, that chapter removed from there. It's also about the way in which the entire syllabus is visualized. So the syllabus is visualized in a particular way to train students, to teach students, to help them to acquire knowledge, both as a historian and about history, but about the protocols of history. But that training would actually remain incomplete. But again, one can see that there's obviously a reluctance to devote too much space to the Mughals. And if seen with the deletion of the chapter on Central Islamic lands, one can see that there is an invisibilizing of a particular kind of history which is associated with Islam. So since many of the rulers of that of this period are supposed to have been sort of happen to be Muslim, it probably is something that they in NCERT felt was they didn't this too much space devoted to them, and that obviously fits in with the agenda, the political agenda of the present dispensation. Now, and the kind of understanding of India's history, its composite culture, which these textbooks were sort of trying to familiarize the student with, are done away with. Then there's another chapter which obviously, again, it's a chapter which is supposed to be a very political chapter, very contentious, but then for historians, it's not possible to escape these debates. This is the chapter entitled Understanding Partition, very sensitively written chapter, which covers displacement, migration, the human tragedy of partition, and also the historical processes which led to partition. Now, this has been completely dropped. Now, this is very unfortunate for the reason that this is a part of India's past which we cannot brush aside. It's so important to an understanding of what happened to India at the moment of independence and what has happened subsequently as well. It's very important. It has contemporary relevance as well. In fact, it's because there is a contemporary relevance that there is a this has become the the target of the NCERT. But there are two things which, from purely sort of academic point of view and also pedagogic point of view, which need to be considered. One is that there's again a great deal of writing on independence and partition. Now, if you don't even sort of give very sort of brief idea to the student about what these writings are like and what are the issues that the historians are grappling with when they're talking about independence and partition, the student doesn't sort of get a sense of that scholarship at all. Moreover, students then are really sort of not able, they don't get the training to handle sensitive themes like partition. And that's again something which this absence, this deletion would make, would leave the student ignorant of a lot of these trends in historical writings on this particular issue. There are other chapters which I don't think probably if there's this issue we can take up during the discussion, but which one is on colonial cities and the other is on industrial revolution. One in the themes in world history book and one in the Indian themes in Indian history book. But towards the end, I would like to refer to one other deletion which somehow has not received adequate attention. And this is the chapter on the first chapter of themes in world history. This is part of the broad theme, which is the first theme in that book, which is entitled Early Societies. And the first chapter in this is titled From the Beginning of Time. From the Beginning of Time. Now, this is a chapter which deals with human evolution and the way in which the the various stages of that evolution. So there's a discussion on the Australopithecus, the Australopithecines, the hominoids, the hominids, the Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and the emergence of Homo sapiens, and the forms which preceded Homo sapiens sapiens. There's a very good discussion on fossils, on the way in which historians use fossils, and there is a discussion on the old Stone Age and Stone Age tools, the Paleolithic. Now, not to be able to talk about the Paleolithic and the changes which occurred, the historical processes which brought about the changes which eventually led to the beginnings of agriculture, the Neolithic, and also then the beginnings of civilization. All that is deleted from this text. In fact, this also has a paragraph incidentally on Darwin, which is deleted, just as the biology textbook has deleted, because the entire chapter is actually deleted. It's a very important chapter, in fact, and think of that student who begins history, studying this history of the longer history of the evolution of human societies, with a discussion on city life in Mesopotamia. So the first chapter now with this deletion is actually the chapter on Mesopotamian urbanization. So you begin immediately with that chapter with the sentence, I think I have somewhere over here, that which says that, the first cities are found in Mesopotamia. That's the first sentence of this textbook, with no historical context, nothing about what goes before it, nothing, no sort of historical processes talked about, and suddenly in the they start off with this. So so there's obviously a pattern which we can also then see in the science textbooks, which probably we'll be talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Farooqi. If I can summarize, Professor Farooqi has talked about how the textbooks, which were written in, according to the NCF 2005, they were written in a certain way, where one theme builds on the previous theme. And with the deletion of one theme in between, what happens is that the students who will be reading these books now, they will be led to a chronological gap, a gap in their understanding of how the history has evolved. And he also speaks in this sense of how it is important to understand history from the point of view of evolution. And when we miss out the topic on evolution, how that, retains, how that furthers the gap in understanding of the students. And he also said that there is, of course, a reluctance in giving a lot of space to certain topics, which is very evident. I would also like to ask the viewers again, I would like to request the viewers again to post their questions on the chat. And now I would like to invite Prabir, who will be primarily talking about the changes in the science curriculum. So I request Prabir.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Okay. The advantage that Professor Farooqi has is that he teaches history and he is familiar with the textbook, the content, the material, and the history of the history textbooks, which is a very rich one. Unfortunately for me, I do not come as a teacher. I've been an engineer, and it is only that I'm here by default because the biologist who should have been speaking on this is not available, Satyajit Rath. So I'm going to echo some of his concerns and follow up with what Professor Farooqi has already said. I think one important issue before I get into that is whenever you have a pedagogical exercise being undertaken, which is the two sets of textbooks that have been made at different points of time, there is a committee, there are discussions, there are people who write these chapters, there is again a discussion after this chapter is written, and there is a process through which these textbooks have been created or have been presented to the students. This is the NCERT process, and it has been a very rich one. You can see the list of people who have participated and the effort that has gone into producing these textbooks, and that itself means an understanding among those who teach history, for example, what this is. So when you come to the process, whether it's a science textbook or history textbook, and you are saying you want to rationalize, reduce the load on the students, given the fact that there has been a huge hit that the students have taken due to COVID-19, epidemic, and that's almost taken out 2 years of their curriculum. The question is that what is the process that has been followed while making these changes? Have the members of the original committee who created these textbooks been consulted? Has a subset of them been consulted? Has an attempt been made to address essentially the questions that Professor Farooqi has raised in front of us? That when you take away certain chunks of the textbook, what happens to the continuity of the textbook and of the material? Who, in that sense, is responsible for editing of the textbooks which have been created out of a collective effort of the community of teachers, both colleges and schools, who finally have given to us a set of books which had a consensus of the community behind it. These textbooks deletions, and these are really deletions, have been done, it appears, with no such process having been undertaken. So, for instance, those who have written these chapters, when they consulted, has the committee which gave sanction to these chapters, have they been consulted? So the community of the people who are responsible for creating these textbooks, their role seems to have been, to my knowledge, zero. In fact, I have been talking to some of the people who have been involved earlier. They all said they do not know how these cuts were really made and even who made them. So we have the familiar, shall we say, the process of this government, that there is no process, that you start by having a completely opaque group of people who have made certain decisions, who have implemented the decisions. Objective of the decision is supposed to be rationalization, but what has been done, is it consistent with the objective of rationalization, still remains. And this is a pedagogical question for which no teachers seem to have been consulted, either school or university teachers or researchers. So therefore, the question that Professor Farooqi raises is a relevant one. What is the objective of these changes? Are they meant for political objectives, which is what is almost staring us in the face when we look at the history textbooks, less so maybe when we look at science. And here is the issue. Science, the target has been biology. Now, why is biology a target is one issue. But also, what is the target in biology? It is not that you're giving too much information, too many facts that is overburdening the student, but you're attacking what would be called the foundation of biology itself. That means if you look at biology, if you looked at it, say, 200 years back, it would really be what would be called classificatory. You classified various animals, plants, you tried to put them based on certain superficial understanding of them, how they look, what are the links, maybe the geographies, and you created certain, I would call, grouping, which is not understood why. But it would be at the best taxonomical. That means you identified what each of these groups are, but you did not know the relationship between them, or your biological understanding really did not allow you to make the leap. What is the connection between them? Yes, life has connections, and what are those connections could not be understood before you get the theory of evolution. The Darwinian theory, Darwin is only one contributor, Darwinian theory of evolution makes sense of biology, makes sense because it tells us why certain things have happened, why certain forms have evolved, and gives us an explanation of how we should look. It is really a foundational issue, how we should look at the taxonomy, the various creatures that we see around us, the plant kingdom we see. So it makes the leap that all that you see has deeper connections, and that deeper connection can be understood only if you understand evolution. So this is something which the biologists have said in different ways, that what makes or binds biology together is essentially theory of evolution or evolution. That without evolution, you do not, it's descriptive at best, but you do not get an understanding of why certain things have happened in biology, and you do not get the connection between what you call as taxonomy, the various things that you see, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, going finer into the species, and from that going further and further till you get to finally the hominidae, and there in that you get the chimpanzees, the baboons, you get, of course, the other bipedal creatures, the human beings. So this whole connection can only be understood, can only be grasped if you have evolution as the connector. And that is the fundamental issue, that when you drop out, I mean, dropping out Darwin as a human being is not the issue, but when you drop out evolution and you cut it away in this fashion, what you do is you're removing from biology the core that today binds biology into sciences. In fact, it binds it into physics, into chemistry, into biology in a way that you can see how change has taken place. The second part that I would like to also bring before you, that when you talk about science, it is not describing what is there, but it is really asking the question, why is it there? Why do certain things happen and certain things don't happen? Why does the apple fall from the tree, to get into the old Newtonian question that Newton got his wisdom only because the apple fell on his head. But the fundamental part of science has been asking not what has happened, but why it has happened. And it is this question of why that is, again, in biology, what makes evolution or the theory of evolution so important. So why is it that the heredity is retained, Mendelian heredity, Mendel is retained, but evolution and Darwin is removed? What could be the reason? And of course, we can only conjecture about the reason because none have been given except to lower the load. Why, for instance, things on agriculture, how there are various things we could do, which are not fundamental to a class 10 biology book. Why are they retained? But evolution is cut out while heredity is retained. This is the riddle that we have to unravel, because the committee, there has been no committee that we know of which has taken the decision, and those who have taken the decision have given a one-line answer: we are trying to rationalize and reduce load. So why was a reduction of load confined to Darwin is a question that has yet to be explained, particularly because various biologists of note have considered evolution is what throws light on something which otherwise is not clear, is not explicable. So given that Darwinian theory of evolution plays such an important role, why is it that Darwin comes under the hammer is a question, or under the knife is the question that remains inexplicable unless we look at the larger socio-political questions behind why heredity is okay, but evolution is not. And here, of course, the fundamental issue is if you accept evolution, then you have to do away with also the understanding why we have a caste system in India, and why therefore certain castes who consider themselves privileged are really privileged by virtue of social power, social, political, economic power, but not by virtue of anything biological. Now that, as you know, is the fundamental tenet of the caste system that you are attacking. Because if you accept that, then this whole notion that we are superior because we are higher caste, which is the real fault lines which have been there over which in ancient times to relatively modern times, even current times, the political system has been built really on these terms. So the minute you question heredity as fixed, not fluid, the minute you question that all of us come from a common origin, and what you see taking evolutionary speed of change, that what you see as 5,000, 6,000 years of really a very small amount of time in biological terms to have any significant change. When you see that 99.9% or 7% of all of us have similar genetic composition, and what is not similar in terms of race, caste, whatever way you take it, are really marginal, then of course you are also left with the issue that human race is much more homogeneous than in fact any others in the animal kingdom. In fact, what has been said, that a group of chimpanzees, maybe 50, 40, a troop of them, would have more variation than the 7 billion human population. Now, this is the other part of biology, or shall we say evolutionary theory, that makes it difficult for a whole bunch of people to accept evolution. Now, if you take the West, though it is clear that evolution was opposed based on the Christian rights argument that God created the universe, but the real opposition to that wasn't this. The real opposition to that was essentially race theory, which said the whites are superior, other races are inferior, particularly because those who had enslaved the blacks, the Africans they had brought over for creating the plantation economy in the Americas, after having created the genocide of the native population being killed. Now, given all of that it was also necessary for white supremacy to be based on new emerging scientific ideas. And they did try at one point to piggyback on Darwin, because Darwin was a person of his time, so he was not free from a lot of this. But a lot of initial evolutionary biology was created on the basis that they could justify race science on that. That failed. And having failed in biology, the battle still to see how to justify race in the West in terms of race privileges are still going on. In India, we have a similar kind of issue with caste. Let's be very clear. The caste system, when we were young, we were always told was based on scientific science, because science has shown there are differences in human beings. And of course, these differences manifest themselves by the caste system that has evolved. Therefore, the same kind of argument of white supremacy was also given by the caste supremacy elements in our society. Therefore, Darwin, or a scientific evaluation of the theory of evolution, is a problem. Of course, there are rather stupid elements that also say various things. We have a minister saying, sages have been there, Brahmins have been there from the beginning. There is no evolution that has taken place. We are always like this. This is the stupid argument. I'm not going to take that very seriously, even if it is based on a minister saying. But there are attempts to also create an Indian evolutionary thought of Dasavatar, etc., which weakly have been presented in different fora, not with much degree of success. So therefore, you cannot really substitute something when you don't have a cogent theory which you can plug in over here. So what is the attempt to be done? Do away with it. But it is again interesting that you do away with the evolution, but you keep heredity because you think that supports essentially the class character of the Indian society. And that's not just a class character, it's also a class caste character of Indian society. So you can see two thrusts over there. One, which is to wipe out the Muslim history as much as they can. Something has to be retained. So you can't do it at one stroke. Maybe we will find that slowly it will become lesser and lesser till it becomes very, very small. I mean, let's not think that Indians are the only one, that the Indian state currently is the only one doing it. If you take European history also tells you that there were the Greeks, there were the Romans, after that there were dark ages. Nothing happened, nowhere in the world. And then you get the age of discovery. The Europeans discovered us, Europeans discovered the Americas, Europeans discovered Africa. The people were always there, but they discovered us, okay? And after that, you suddenly see there is the 3 centuries that are based on discovery become age of enlightenment. Enlightenment brings science and technological revolution, and thereafter that you have really capitalism and the growth of the economy at an explosive pace. And that is why European powers and now United States is so important. Now this history wipes out the history that Professor Faruqi was talking about, the civilizations that have been there always, and the fact that what you call enlightenment, it wasn't, the dark ages were not there in other parts of the world. It was only in Europe you had the dark ages, and the enlightenment really came from what he also talked about, from Spain, where the Umayyads had occupied Spain. It was under Arabs for about 700 years, I think 900 years, and a lot of the so-called enlightenment has to be traced to the Iberian Peninsula. But I'm not getting into that debate. The point I'm making is this rewriting of history has two purposes. One is to take away huge chunks of history, like the West has done, not talking about the slavery, not talking about genocide, and not talking about the loot and plunder of Asia or West Asia, not talking about, for instance, the opium trade, or saying these are all peripheral. So you have that kind of history you created by excising large parts, surgically removing large parts of that history, then creating an alternate history. Let us understand that when you talk about Indian history today, the project, which is much younger, which has started here, is exactly of a similar kind. A so-called scepter of supposedly presented by somebody in Tamil Nadu becomes now what was central to the transfer of power in India. Not that the Indian people struggled to have their independence, they really made British rule impossible. That transfer of power is taking place because British was forced to transfer power, and it was not symbolized by a stick, walking stick of gold, or a red stick as it is called, but it was really symbolized by the people's struggle. Now, all of that is sought to be wiped out, and you had the symbol of power, transfer of power, as a particular stick which a particular jeweler had supposedly given Nehru. Now, all of this is to create an alternate history. I'm not going to call it mythology, alternate history. And let's not think that this is the only history that has been created in this fashion. This is something which is also what the West has done more successfully. These people at the moment have a historical moment which is not so conducive for them to be able to create this kind of mythical history. But the attempt is really that, and the attempt is to really confront the question. Don't ask why. That this is what they don't want. They don't want explanations to be given. They don't want understanding to be given. Therefore, fundamentally, can we, through the education system, excise, take away, surgically remove the not simply Muslims, not simply Darwin, but the fundamental process of science, which is asking why things have happened, why is there certain uniformities in nature, why are there regularities in nature, what is it that we can correct them to, and in fact, how can we explore nature? The historical method, the scientific method, fundamentally, is to make sense of what is there around us and to be able to explain to ourselves the larger things that are happening, explanation of why that has occurred. Therefore, as I said, the fundamental attack is on the question why. Why in history or why in science? And of course, the method that is followed is the opaque method of dictum. We don't know from where, with the imprimatur of the state. I'm going to stop here and hope there will be questions which Professor Farooqi has largely to handle.
Thank you, Prabir. So Prabir has talked about how writing textbooks is a pedagogical process and why the deletions should be looked at from a pedagogical point of view, and how they also create a pedagogical gap, which Professor Farooqi called as the chronological gap when we look at the historical construction of themes. And he also said that deletion of a theme like evolution from biology textbooks serves the purposes of the global, the racism, the supremacists of race and the caste supremacists, because that is the core to understand biology. And with its removal, what happens is that you only look at the taxonomies of understanding different things, but you do not see the connection in them. So there is a chronological gap which these deletions have brought in front of us. So we have some questions which I would like to raise now. And okay, so the first question is whether these actions should be looked at as pre-planned action of the right-wing government. The second question is, we know that the NCERT textbooks were developed by extremely qualified and eminent scholars. What about the members of the textbook revision committee? Are they also serious academicians? The third question is, have we seen same kind of an attack on reasoning and scientific temper before? After these three questions, there are some more which we can take later. Or should I read a few more? So you are mute.
I said I've already forgotten the first.
Okay, so I'll read Farooqi, one by one.
Professor Farooqi can answer that.
Okay.
You're also muted, I think.
No, the reason why I started by referring to what happened to the earlier set of textbooks is precisely to point out that there has been a sustained sort of offensive against history writing of a particular kind. Now, in the 60s, when initially these textbooks were written, there was a committee which consisted of, again, eminent scholars like Neelkant Shastri, Tarachand, Sheshwar Prasad, who were part of this effort to write history books which would sort of be in line with the way in which the discipline has developed. After textbooks reflect the consensus, the scholarly consensus on various aspects of aspects of any discipline. So the idea was to have textbooks of that kind, and that's why. And I think we need to bear in mind that this was something that people like Romila Thapar or R.S. Sharma or Satish Chandra, Bipin Chandra, who had obviously other things to do. They had their own research to take care of. Writing a textbook is not an easy thing, but they decided to sort of, this was their commitment to the discipline, which brought them to sort of, which made them write these textbooks. But in 1977, there was a major attack on these books. This part is not good. That thing has been overemphasized. This thing has been underemphasized. That sentence is wrong. Now, these are things which, and obviously it was almost a similar kind of attack. One of the things was that too much emphasis on Mughals. So, I mean, things of that kind, or, in the case of ancient India, the way in which caste was discussed. Prabir was talking about, why issues of caste are something that are so sort of important to the right wing, and the way in which they see Indian society and hierarchies in Indian society, gender. So, those are things which were, again, gender, class, race. All these are things which, from the right-wing point of view, were these books were teaching children wrong things. And that's why that attempt was made. Similarly, when the initial, with the prior to the UPA, the first NDA experiment that was there, again, immediately started off with the history textbooks. So these are history textbooks which should not be taught. And then after that, so the argument eventually became that, these books need to be updated. These books, that was the argument that was being pushed that time, that books need to be updated. So, but updated how? Eventually, after 2005, then, another committee was formed, and they did undertake this task of updating the textbooks, wrote textbooks in a very different way. Actually, if you compare the textbooks, the 60s, 70s textbooks with this set of textbooks, you would find that the way in which they have dealt with the subject is very different. So, so the updating was not just in terms of, historical scholarship on things which were not talked about, or on which there wasn't sufficient focus in earlier writings, now got a lot of focus. And I was talking about, for instance, in the case of the Mughals, the Mughal issues of sovereignty, kingship. I mean, there's been courtly ritual. These are things which have received a lot of attention. In fact, some of the very interesting research which has been done in recent years is on Mughal painting. And also the huge translation projects. All those are there in that chapter, which has been deleted, actually. Fortunately, we still have those the earlier textbooks with us, so one can refer back to them. But those portions are deleted. So it was all, but it was also the there were pedagogical issues also, which the new committee tried to address, to teach history in a slightly different way. So rather than a straightforward narrative, to sort of break it up into, other kinds of, break up a theme into various components, which then students can grasp perhaps with a little greater ease and have greater interest, make things a little more interesting. One of the criticisms of the earlier textbooks was that they are too drab and dull. So in these textbooks, there are lots of illustrations, although the printing isn't really sort of very good quality, but nevertheless, they've made that effort. So, but this is also a team of very eminent scholars, people again who devoted their time to this because they thought they had a commitment to the discipline, and therefore that to teaching good history. So I know that many of those who are associated with there are people with whom I share. I know them personally. I know they put in a great deal of effort, great deal of time. The Central Islamic lands. My colleague Professor Sunil Kumar, I remember, was sort of associated with the the team that was writing that. I remember that he spent a lot of time on this. And what Prabir was saying about the syllabus is right. The kind of effort which goes into designing that syllabus, what should be taught, how it should be taught, those are things which I think need to be taken into account. And I quite agree that they didn't consult. And many of the scholars have pointed out that they haven't, they don't know what has, the way these changes have been made. I mean, that is the minimum courtesy. And it's really amusing. They've not been consulted. Changes have been made, but the acknowledgements remain the same. So it's as if they are responsible for all that that's wrong with these textbooks.
There are two similar questions. One question is, and the question is to you, Professor Farooqi. The question is, there were similar attempts to rewrite history in the last NDA regime too. There was huge resistance at that time. And how is it different in this time? The second question is, among all social science disciplines, we see history being changed or attacked the most. It is always into controversy. Why is this the case? Why would matters of history become more emotional than other forms of narrative?
No, I think, what I quite agree. The last time also there were attempts, but there's a slight difference, the thing that, again, Prabir was talking about. At least there was, outwardly, there was this, the process, at least they tried to show in that regime that at least they're following some process. So there was some consultation, some historians were associated with it, some scholars were associated. This time, apparently, there's no process. So obviously, I know there are one or two names which are there in the textbooks about, those who have been consulted, but I don't think it's really been, it's there just, for the sake of formality, just to say that, that they followed a process, but there's been no process. So, but the problems are more or less similar. The problems that the right wing had with earlier textbooks are the problems which it has with these textbooks as well. And the issues are similar, but of course now it's in a more aggressive manner. And I'm sure that there'll be historians, there'll be people who would be willing to rewrite the books. This, to me, seems a kind of a stopgap arrangement. And sooner or later, we'll have a different set of textbooks. That's how I think, so this is for the time being, but maybe meanwhile, we'll have other books. So they'll be written in different ways. Let
me come in here.
History,
let me come in for a moment over here. I think there is one fundamental issue that should not be forgotten, that NDA had at least, supposedly, a coalition government. The BJP was not alone in power. So that's a very important issue. And the trappings of the parliament, that these things can go up to the parliament, that can go up to public response to that, all those things were relatively better at that stage. purely because BJP had not become so powerful. At the moment, the fact that it has a single majority in parliament also means it can ride roughshod over even the parliament itself. And all of that, given the fact there is a much wider set of attacks on the civil liberties, attacks on life of the people, that if you're a minority, you have a chief minister of UP who says we can encounter you. Now, these changes is that the attack vector, if you use my terminology, the attack vector is much broader and more powerful than it was at that time. Therefore, defense was relatively more easy to organize, and you could hold them much better. And because of a coalition government, therefore their allies themselves did not want to go in that direction. Therefore, there was some break. Those things are off. Therefore, the probably new history textbooks will be 2024 elections. The result of that. They don't have the time to do it before that, perhaps. So you might see if the 2024 elections go their way, then they will say, now we have got the stamp to do whatever we want regarding not only the future, but regarding the past as well.
Yeah, and about history being, the position that you take in history is obviously determined by your ideological framework and your politics. So it will always be politics. Yeah, Prabir was talking about the question of race. Now, race is a political question, and if you have to see history in terms where you justify race, then it will be history of a different kind, and then there will be resistance to that kind of history also. So history is political, just as in fact most social sciences are, and of course also large areas of natural sciences also. Yeah.
So one question is to you, Prabir sir. So one YouTube viewer has asked that Darwin's theory of evolution has not been disproved. So why are they removing? So, I mean, how can they justify this move?
Well, they said it's too much of a load for class 10. So if you have the rational discourse, you will say, well, there are lots of things in that textbook which could be removed. There is ecological systems and so on, which are descriptive. And if you want to reduce load on the student, then those are the things you can take away if you want to. I do agree that the argument that we pack too much perhaps in our textbooks, instead of focusing on more explanatory parts, particularly in science, could be an argument. I'm not saying it is or it is not. I'm not a teacher, so I cannot talk about pedagogical load. The simple issue is, what do you do? What is the part you take away? And as I said, Darwin is supposed to be the one, or theory of a revolution is the one which connects, makes sense of biology. Otherwise, biology becomes descriptive. Okay, the whole historiography, for instance, how you study history has moved from description of kings, queens, kingdoms, and so on, to trying to explain what happened in society and therefore what happens in history. Now, explanatory part, what it does is it allows the student to have a much better structure, not only to understand but to remember. Otherwise, it becomes mugging, just mugs dates, kingdoms, and that's your history. So this is the essential part where when you talk about the scientific method, this is what really is coming into being. How do you look at what is history? What is biology? And that's the point that I'm raising, that if you take what is biology, then as I think Dobiansky has said, you can make sense of biology only in the light of evolution. Now, that is the statement which I think is very fundamental to how you teach pedagogy of teaching biology, that you cannot make sense of biology unless you have evolution. Otherwise, you do not understand why species look so similar and have connections, but what is the explanation for that? Now, that is biology at its best, which is a theory of evolution. It's not Darwin that's the issue. As I said, Darwin himself was on the question of race. He was a racist. Let's be very clear. He shared the prejudices of his time. Okay, so that is not the issue. A lot of evolutionary biology was in fact developed by those who believed that they could justify race. Unfortunately for them, the justifications failed. Okay, but if you look at the two people who really created evolutionary biology, the genetic basis of it, that is, one is Fisher, who is a racist, other is Haldane, who was a Marxist, and he died as an Indian because he took Indian citizenship when he died. Okay, of course, the right is not going to remember him as somebody who forsook his British passport and decided to take Indian citizenship. So these are the two people who founded essentially modern biology on the basis of genetics. So this is the history. I'm sorry to use the history in this context. This is the history of biology when we take it, that explanation is what you require for making students understand. And taking away, therefore, Darwin is to take away explanation and make it into ruttification, ratta lagao biology, which is the biology we studied. Honestly, this is the biology we studied. And it was really ruttoing. So that is also the history we studied, by the way, Amar. So history and biology were in par at that time.
So now we have the last two questions, and I would like both of you to answer this. So someone has asked, now if somebody understands that things are being rewritten, both history and science are being rewritten, how do we deal with it? How do we fight it out? And the second thing is, how should teachers at the moment should understand the attack that the attack on curriculum? So both of you, if both of you can speak on this.
Amar, shall I go first on this? Because you'll have more to say as usual on this. Okay, so I presume Amar is saying yes, because he's still muted. So I'm going to start by saying that, resistance has the classic feature which is common to all resistance. You have to organize, you have to fight it at the level of ideas, at the level of struggle, at the level of organized protests. All of this has to take place, and this is common to all resistance. So therefore, the resistance is not going to be different, whether it is a Kisans struggling for their rights, the workers struggling for their rights, and the students and teachers fighting for essentially their right to a proper education. I'm going to stop here, Amar. It's after that, it's all yours.
No, I think, in fact, I started by referring to the fact that there is already a substantial body of writing which has critiqued the way in which these textbooks have been the deletions that have been made, the changes that have been made. And I think, that is very much a part of that resistance also. So it is, making people aware about what is going on, looking at this, trying to figure out what could be prompting these changes, what is the pattern that you have. So I think, that resistance, but as Prabhu was saying, this has to be part of, a larger sort of a larger struggle, and this you can't de-link it from other critiques or other issues that people are struggling for. As far as teachers specifically are concerned, I think the purpose of a lot of this writing is to make them aware of what's going on. They themselves, obviously, in the classroom are facing similar problems. I mean, I really sympathize with the teacher who in class 12 would have to start by teaching Mesopotamia without providing any kind of historical context or background. Some a teacher who is talking to students in school about without taking into account the larger history of a larger part of the history of humans, of human societies. I mean, the period we'll be talking about will be a very short period of about something like 5,000 years, but there's a much longer history. In fact, by the way, in that early societies chapter, there's also a paragraph which is devoted to time on this scale. So making students aware of the scale on which changes take place. In fact, evolution cannot be understood at all without having a sense of that scale. So, they provided students with a history which doesn't take into account all these things, and these are going to be difficult problems which the individual teacher has to solve in the classroom. So disconnected, disjointed accounts which student they'll have to deal with. So that's why it's actually important for them to be also aware of what's happening and why it's happening.
Sorry. So one more question has come up. The question is to you, Prabir sir, and it is in the context of maintaining the part of heredity in the curriculum. So the question is, why would any government like to justify casteism under democracy, given the present caste composition of the Indian society?
Well, they're not saying we justify caste system, but it is an implicit assumption when you talk of heredity without talking about change. So you make it as if it is something which is static, which doesn't change. Therefore, you sort of are born generations into what you were. So if you don't see change, if you don't see the basis of evolution, which is what change really is, then of course you can justify what our grandmothers and mothers and fathers less, mothers more, that you should really have arranged marriages because we'll get a good girl and you will be the same, essentially not saying caste is caste, but essentially implying that. So that's how we control, shall we say, caste-based descent, by essentially controlling marriage. So all these arguments we have heard when we were children, not from the textbooks, but if you have something which says in the textbook, which is problematic for this kind of explanation, retaining heredity and taking out evolution seems to be then an exercise, because 90% of the students will study 3 days, or at least maybe our times it was different, your times has been different, and so the current times will study a few weeks before the exams and rattu. And therefore this is ideal for rattification, not questioning knowledge, not questioning the world. And I think the purpose of education, or good education, is to make people think for themselves and question things. And that's why I said, to explain, answer why. This is what they don't want from Indian education. And that's the whole idea of what kind of education they want you to have.
I think with this, we come to the end of our discussion. On behalf of Anveshan and Delhi Science Forum, I thank Prabir Puttayastha and Professor Amar Farooqi for speaking with us. And I also thank the Newsclick team for live streaming the discussion. I also thank the viewers who have joined in from different platforms. And I would like to tell the viewers that Newsclick has been conducting regular discussions on the topic of NCERT changes. And I would like to invite them to go and visit the Newsclick website so that they are updated with what has been happening. These discussions are happening with the people who were who were involved in the writing of the textbook. So to better understand what is there and what is happening, it is good to watch these videos. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Prabir sir. Thank you, Professor Faruqi. Thanks.
Thank you.